Hey everybody. Okay, so today we are going to pick up where we left off last time with marsh habitat preservation and restoration. And I want to pick up with to plant, are we going to plant or not, right? In some cases, what are we going to plant? So when you're evaluating these different marsh types, so for instance, low marsh or emergent marsh, right? These Spartina marshes that we often plant in our coastal environment in the Galveston Bay system. These are marshes that, if the conditions are right, can really establish very quickly. So, by right conditions, I mean you've got the right soil elevation, you have conditions that are not prone to high wave erosion. And this is because of the way these seeds germinate when they grow. And truthfully, this can be a factor you have to consider even if you're doing something like sprigging, right, where you've already germinated the plants and you're planting the seedlings. In either instance, you have to think about how the way these plants work. So when the seeds germinate, their initial job is to create as much shoot biomass as possible so that they can start to photosynthesize, right? And this is not unusual for most plants. Um, Create a lot of shoot biomass because there's not a lot of material in the seed for the plant to work off of. So it's got to start to feed itself pretty doggone quickly. So with these Spartina marshes, you can get a significant amount of shoot biomass, oftentimes within a few months even. I had one site out on Dickinson Bayou that um, we planted, and it was actually the second planting, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The second planting, we had great success, and within 6 months, it looked a lot like what you're seeing here in this picture. This is not a picture of that actual site, but looked very similar to this. However, the root biomass was low, as it typically is. Now, that's not to say there won't be any. Of course, there's going to be some, but typically these low coastal marshes, they don't produce a lot of root biomass over the first couple of years. Their production is really geared towards creating a lot of above ground biomass, and then they'll start to switch energy. It's kind of interesting. So they'll kind of switch energy into producing more root biomass, and over time, what we see is in the initial year or two after planting. Um, you'll have this high shoot to root ratio, but then over the subsequent years until you get out to about year five, you'll see the shoot biomass oftentimes start to decrease, both in terms of the shoot height, the amount of dry biomass that's produced, and sometimes in terms of stem density. So the stem density initially can be really tight, and then over time it'll start to open up. During that time, you'll see that the root biomass will start to increase very significantly, and the density of those roots will start to become much greater. And that's as the plant is starting to mature, and that's when the real work starts to happen. On the part of the plant community itself, in terms of modifying the soils, really starting to protect those soils, and those plants starting to establish. Now, they're still a ways out from that biologic community is still quite a ways out from reaching its peak functional value, but you get the sense of it. So the problem here is that there is that kind of period, especially during that first couple of years, where they can be quite susceptible to disturbance, particularly wave-driven erosion. That same site that I was mentioning out on Dickinson Bayou, the first time we planted it, we did a mix of Spartina and California bulrush. So we had the Gulf cordgrass, the California bulrush, and we had a little storm that went through upstream in Dickinson Bayou, but it created quite a bit of stream flow. And a couple of days later, we went out, and all of our plants, or not all of them, but most of them were floating. Many of them were lost and washed downstream, and it's just devastating. There are some things you can do to mitigate that kind of impact. So you can see here, there's a temporary breakwater. That's not unusual to put in some sort of temporary wave break, especially in areas that you think are going to be more susceptible to wave-driven erosion to protect those plants early on. We've talked about a lot of this, so this should be a little bit of review. Mangroves, so mangroves have their own issues. There have been some big studies, and I referenced some in here. Mangrove restoration is tricky in and of itself. A lot of mangrove restoration, the plantings in many places, they put these mangroves and they put them out on mud flats. But as you know, mangroves typically don't have high survival in those mud flat areas. They really prefer the seedlings do. They prefer environments where there are mature trees for them to grow under, right? So there are other approaches. Sometimes there's efforts for natural recruitment. Sometimes there's incorporation of these what are referred to as semi-permeable dams, which boost sedimentation, and that in turn it creates more appropriate elevations for natural recruitment. Um, so one study looked at 14 different locations in 11 countries, and it revealed that you, in spite of the amount of money that, and sometimes millions of dollars of funding put into planting mangroves in huge numbers, it didn't really increase the survivorship of the plants, and the result was not really significant. And sometimes the results seemed a little counterintuitive on the surface, if you pardon the pun. Generally, where you had storms, erosion, where the elevation was not high enough, the planting survival was really low, as you would expect. In some areas, you had high planting survival, but they didn't survive in the areas you would have hoped for, and they actually end up displacing other species, particularly seagrasses. So whether or not to plant is somewhat species specific, and it is definitely project specific, right? You really have to look at the conditions, and you also have to project forward, looking out into the future to determine, okay, what are the conditions likely to be over this time frame, especially when these plants are very susceptible to things like erosion. That is a really big factor. With seagrasses, that's a whole nother layer of difficulty, right? So there are methods applying plugs. There was a lot of that done in West Galveston Bay 25 years ago. I know GBF, we worked with NOAA on some of those efforts and did some of the monitoring with that. And with seagrasses, they tend to be successful or more likely to be successful where you have good water quality. And by good water quality, I mean good water clarity. Seagrasses, as we've seen in the past, they do not tolerate turbidity in the water because it really creates problems in terms of light penetration, can actually smother the plants in some instances, and that's problematic. But in those good conditions, they will work. But this is a very labor intensive method to get out there and do it. And anytime you're doing any sort of sprigging or setting plugs of any sort, that's labor intensive. That's often done by hand. And it can be very destructive to the source of wherever you're getting those plants from. So if you're harvesting them from natural beds, that can be really problematic, right? That's why being able to propagate your own material and why we focus on that with a lot of coastal restoration. It's difficult with seagrasses, but with things like emergent marsh, having a wetland facility, a nursery of sorts like GBF has up in Baytown, that can be really helpful because then you're not having to damage natural stocks in order to come up with your restoration material. Um, it's going to be quite expensive. There's mechanical equipment that can help you with this. I don't have experience with that particular equipment, but I understand that it can be make things a little more efficient than doing it by hand, but you're still talking about significant amounts of money in order to do this. So high effort, high cost in order to achieve some functional benefit. Um, so with marsh, emergent marsh, you can utilize sprigs. We talked a little bit about this previously. So the sprigging effort is again pretty good if you're able to. Um, and this is true of seagrasses too, by the way. You can get out there, you can try and put these sprigs in. Again, if the water quality is okay, you can have fairly good results. If this is less destructive because you're taking smaller plants, you're not taking as much soil, but here again, it's very labor intensive and can be quite expensive, especially if you're having to pay for the labor. Or plants typically in most of my projects, plants range somewhere, for Spartina alterniflora, for instance, you may pay anywhere from $1.25 to maybe as much as $3 for a plug if you're paying for them. But again, having a nursery where you can propagate your own specimens, whatever they are, whether that's mangroves, whether it's Spartina alterniflora, that can definitely be a benefit. Um, you can broadcast seeds. This is true. So this is true for again a variety of plants. Uh, the benefit here is that it's relatively easy to do and you can cover large areas. Um, you can, but the problem here is that collecting the seeds can be very time consuming, right? In many instances, that has to be done by hand. Again, this can be done with seagrasses. You'll see this done with low marsh plants like Spartina alterniflora. Um, One of the other benefits I will say with seeding, again from experience, is that when you seed, so I'll use Spartina alterniflora as an example, those seeds float, and when they float, they can find the right elevation on their own. I mean, again, they're very adapted to this. They're adapted to these environments. They are adapted to finding the right elevations in order to germinate. So generally, seeding can be quite successful because instead of you going out and trying to locate the right elevation when you're putting a sprig in, the seeds are going to do some of that for you. However, it's also easy for the seeds to be washed away during that, when they're first germinating, just like when you're putting in plugs, right? When they first germinate, they're very delicate, I guess is the word that I'm looking for. Um, the other thing is that not all species. So Spartina alterniflora actually they have a pretty good germination rate. Many plants, so Thalassia, for instance, when we're looking at seagrasses, they don't produce a lot of seed, and the seed germination rate is really low. So that can determine whether or not you're going to have good success. Um, Another method for some plants is to broadcast rack. This can be helpful for seagrasses. It's cheap. It's not terribly destructive because you're taking part of that plant. Here again, the problem is that, finding sources. And you do have to be careful when you're broadcasting loose material in. So in areas, for instance, where there are power plants or other water intakes. That can be problematic in terms of actually blocking those intakes and doesn't benefit you in terms of actually creating new plant beds, right? If that material is getting sucked up in these screens, it's not getting to the place you want it. So, the techniques are continuing to change. You're going to see a lot and you'll continue to see a lot of changes as we move forward. This comes out of individual projects where the project managers are innovative. You know, they're looking at the conditions on the ground, they're looking at what the future environment is, and they are finding ways to do this that are more effective and more both in terms of the costs overall. So they're more efficient, but also in terms of cost, but they're also more efficient in terms of productivity. Um, there are a lot of organizations. One really comes to mind because I'm more involved with them is Restore America's Estuaries. They have biennial conferences, so every other year, and then the in-between years they have these tech transfer workshops. If you ever have the opportunity to go to one, they come swing around in the Galveston area often about every 2 or 3 cycles. So probably about once every 6 years, you'll see either a tech transfer workshop or an actual full-blown conference in this area. And it's a great opportunity to see what is emerging in these fields. And there's a lot. I put some notes down here. You know, there's a lot going on just specific to seagrasses, for instance. So there's value in sharing this information. So not just in the literature, but actually getting to talk to the people who are doing the work. Because sometimes these techniques have transferability from one site to the other, especially if they're reasonably similar conditions, or even some part of what they did might have applicability to a different site. This is the same with studying these on the back end. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so in Galveston Bay, you know, seagrass coverage has declined significantly since the 1950s. And the reasons behind this include a lot of things. And we've talked about this previously. Subsidence, development, water discharge. Turbidity is a really big deal. You know, in the 1950s through the 70s and 80s, boat traffic in Galveston Bay has increased significantly as a lot of these little subdivisions have come along. So, for instance, West Galveston Bay was a real hot spot for that. You see more inland canals that have channels that get out through the shallow parts behind the bay and out into the deeper areas. And the dredging and just the turbidity from the boat traffic has increased the turbidity in Galveston Bay substantially since that time, and that, you know, in turn affects the seagrasses negatively. Things like storms. Hurricane Carla was a particularly big one that hit seagrasses really hard in the early 1970s, and combined with these other anthropogenic impacts, really made recovery very difficult. So, part of what you should be hearing here is that if you're going to have a successful seagrass restoration effort, the water quality needs to be your first area of focus. Okay. Seagrasses, you know, if they won't survive as established beds, they're probably not going to survive as plugs or seedlings or rack, right? You're just not going to see that. So there have been some improvements in the water quality in Galveston Bay over the previous probably 2 decades. This includes reduced waterfront dredging, more upland placement of dredge material, or utilization of dredge material in appropriate areas where oftentimes that dredge material can be used for low marsh establishment, for instance. We'll touch on some of those as well. Better wastewater management has definitely been an improvement as well, and something I didn't put on here, but in areas where you are adjacent to uplands, better control of storm runoff and silty material in that runoff definitely helps as well. So overall, that means currently, seagrass restoration now is more feasible. But then again, you still have to think about, okay, what approach are we going to use? Um, Sometimes you can use a combination of continuing to improve conditions with structural elements in order to then allow for natural recruitment to occur. So an example of this would be in the Galveston, in the state park there behind Galveston Island. There's some natural rupia colonization that occurred early in, and rupia can be ephemeral. And so if you want to establish a perennial seagrass bed, how are you going to do that? One of the ways they they accomplished this was number one, installing terraces. So you remember those grid type terraces that are back there behind the state park. But also, we talked about geotubes previously. Geotubes can be particularly helpful as a kind of a temporary measure for stilling the water, which allows for the water to clarify because the solids will slowly drop out of the water column, right? That in turn can increase light penetration over longer periods of time, which kind of give those beds a kickstart, but also allows them to persist over longer periods of time. The longer they're there, the more recruitment you get, the bigger the beds get, and it just becomes kind of a positive reinforcement mechanism. So to that point, where you had these newly protected areas, you started to see additional species start to colonize. Um, there were a lot of approaches that they tried in order to establish this, in order to supplement that natural recruitment. And that included some of the methods we talked about previously. Um, through those efforts, they've got about 16 hectares. So a hectare is about 2.5 acres, right? Of regenerated Halophila and Haliduli in the state park. The question is that enough, right? Their management goal is 600 hectares or thereabouts, which is approximately 30% of the historic aerial coverage, right? So there's still a long way to go, and they're continuing. This is a continued effort. So you're going to see more breakwater structures that will protect um, parcels. So the most recent one was looking at about 5 hectares of creation, but this is expensive work. We're talking millions of dollars oftentimes for these restoration projects, and you'll see this is true over most types of restoration. Again, the expense on the construction side, particularly, can be really high. Now, one of the good things when it comes to seagrasses, and this is true of a lot of marshes, is that persistence pays off, and time can really be your friend if you can maintain that persistence. We have certainly seen this in Chesapeake Bay, which arguably has had impacts historically that are at least that we've had in Galveston Bay, if not more. Um, they've seen recovery over 3,500 acres in the past 20 years, but they put in 70 million seeds. So, but there's value to that, right? If you maintain that persistence, that those plants become kind of the epicenter for a whole biologic community that benefits from that. So you see more diversity in the animal communities. You see better function in terms of sequestering carbon and nitrogen and other nutrients. So a lot of value there. And you can read about this again. I'm putting stuff down in the notes section, so when you look at the notes, you can see that. All right. So is it worth it? You know, it's a yes and no answer. I think again, as a practitioner, these don't always work. In spite of our best efforts, in spite of our best engineering, in spite of throwing a lot of money and effort at these, sometimes they just don't take hold. And in those instances, it isn't always cost effective. In some instances, it may look good at the beginning, and over time, they start to fail. Now, again, from personal experience, I have done monitoring on a lot of marshes, both as a practitioner and then as a researcher, including some where I was overseeing the construction at one point, and then a decade later or more, I've gone back out there as part of a grant-funded research project and done research how those have done, and in some cases I've been surprised, pleasantly or unpleasantly, and I think a big part of it comes down to really doing your homework up front, really determining what your best chances of success are at that particular spot. Again, these are custom jobs. There really is not a one size fits all. And unfortunately, funding sometimes dictates, like we talked about in the last class period, different costs. Uh, there are different costs for different strategies, but different strategies are sometimes necessary in order to have a successful outcome in a specific location. So if costs are driving the method you're choosing, you may not be successful in the end. So you really have to look at method as your first. That has to be the first thing you're looking at, and then try and figure out the costs on the back end. And again, these are not, as you can see here, these are not inexpensive projects. One project one of the last projects I did when I was at GBF or worked on, I did some of the talks work on it. That was a $1.25 million project for a relatively small creation that we did up there, and that's not particularly high in the world of restoration. Even a few acres can be really significant. So you really have to do your homework up front, because for not only for the ecologic outcome that you're working towards, but in terms of how to best spend the funds that you have available to create the most marsh, that work up front really is critical. The best thing you can do, the best thing we can do as a society, is avoid the need for restoration in the first place. And that takes me back to preservation and why I think preservation is so important. If you can preserve something before it's impacted, you're far more likely to have success than if you have to go back in and fix something. Again, I'm going back to what my grandfather used to say: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Okay. All right. So looking back at our clicker questions here, you should be able to answer this. If you can't, come and talk to me. All right. So speaking of mitigation, we talked previously about the requirements for mitigation under the Clean Water Act and the no net loss policy. Restoration is oftentimes utilized as a means for compensating for impacts, as I mentioned previously. I've done some of those types of projects. So there are some requirements for that. You know, Mitigation really has to be in the same watershed as the impact. Okay, so that's part of the requirement under Section 404 as it was revised. And that's a good thing, because it ensures that the water body that's being impacted, that drainage area that's being impacted, is going to receive compensatory benefits that are going to offset those impacts, right? The problem here is how the watershed is defined, right? And so watersheds can be quite large. The Galveston Bay watershed, if you look at the whole watershed, it extends clear up, north of Dallas Fort Worth if you're following the Trinity River. So if you have impacts that are occurring down here, in the lower part of the watershed, and the offsets are way up here, well, is that like for like? Is it really going to be compensatory? Um, so these are things you have to consider when you're looking at that. And fortunately, like we talked about last time, there's really a drive to do more mitigation in mitigation banks as opposed to these small individual projects. And there are more and more mitigation banks throughout our watershed, and this is true for much of the country. And so that means that oftentimes those mitigation projects have better success rates, and they are closer to where the impacts actually occur. All right, so let's walk back through that for a second. So whenever you do have those unavoidable impacts, you might have, there are instances where you can mitigate through a small individual restoration near the development site. Now, again, in that three-tiered structure that we looked at, this is the last choice, right? This is not the first choice that the Corps of Engineers or the EPA is going to try and send you to. Now, that wasn't historically the case. When I started, often this was the first choice. There weren't a lot of mitigation banks. There was a lot of individual restoration projects. Sometimes you saw developers working with entities, nonprofit entities in particular, to manage restoration projects for them. We did some of that at GBF, but the tide has turned, and I'm glad to see that because, again, mitigation banks have shown to be far more successful. Nonetheless, when you see these, they can be relatively cheap. In some cases, they can be good PR. The land developer can say, hey, look, yeah, we heard this over here, but it wasn't that good anyway. And look at this great thing we did over here. However, in actual practice, the ecologic quality of these sites, as we saw previously from the research that Hark did just in our area, they're not always successful. And in many cases, they're not even meeting their regulatory requirements, which are relatively low in my particular opinion as a practitioner. They're small, they're sometimes isolated, so there's not a lot of continuity between the habitat that they create and surrounding areas of habitat. One project, I didn't work on the particular project, but I did a review on a permit, and the landholder, this was on Clear Lake. Did I mention that? In any event, on the shoreline there, they were building a great big marina and restaurants in and all this sort of stuff. It is what they were projecting to do. And so that was going to impact shoreline wetlands. And they built this little tiny restoration site to offset just the minimum amount that they could do for the wetlands that were impacted. And no other habitat was connected to this. So when they were done, it was just going to be this little swath of low marsh adjacent to this great big developed site. And wasn't particularly functional. It wasn't an area that had any continuity with anything else. So the wetland was so small, on a functional level, it was useless, right? Didn't really manage to do anything. And yet they could say, look at this great thing we did. And most people would know the difference. All right. So you as scientists would be able to recognize this, right? All right. So again, can they be successful? I don't think so. I think it is somewhat site specific. If you're doing a small restoration that is part of maybe a larger swath of restoration, thinking about habitat corridors that we talked about last lecture, possibly, you know, it's tough. I think it really takes a lot of thoughtfulness, and you have to have whoever is doing the work. Um, it's really helpful if they are working in collaboration with the agencies that oversee these permits, with the natural resource agencies, and with others like nonprofits that do this type of work to coordinate and to be sure that their techniques are going to be successful and that there's going to be means for managing that as those marshes establish. Um, we talked about fragmentation before. There are very few instances where there might be some benefit, but I would say more often than not that it's going to be detrimental. Okay, so we talked about mitigation banking. Again, I'm a fan of mitigation banking. If you have unavoidable impacts, that these tend to be far more successful. Now, it is true that sometimes the ecologic quality might be different than the impacted area. However, in those instances, a lot of times functional assessments are taken into consideration so that if you can't if you can't buy credits for the same type of wetland that you're impacting and you have to buy credits for something else, oftentimes if the function of that something else is not equitable, the amount of credits you buy are increased in order to better that equitability, if you will. So here in our area, I've mentioned the Greens Bayou Mitigation Bank before. This is a great bank. It's one of the older banks in our area. It's up in off the San Jacinto River. It's operated by the Harris County Flood Control District, and it includes a wide array of habitat types that are natural to our area. And so as these credits get bought out, the flood control district can do more restoration. So many of these areas in the bank area initially were impacted. So these weren't necessarily pristine areas to start out with, but they can restore them. And then the credits help protect those wetlands, allow for them to establish, to be maintained, but also helps fund additional than restoration as they move forward. So I've seen some expansions of this bank over the course of my career, and it's a pretty cool thing. Because these are professionally managed and monitored, the success rate on these is significantly higher, as we saw. And so, again, big fan here of this approach. Now, if you look across our area, so you can find this if you go to the Houston Advanced Research Center site. I think this might be available through the Galveston Bay Estuary Programs website as well, because my recollection is correct. They actually funded part of this work. If you look across the Galveston Bay site, and you look at the Houston Advanced Research Center site, and you look at what are the impacts here. So if you look in our just the local Galveston Bay watershed, so I'm waving my hand at you, but let me use my laser pointer. Like maybe I've done this before. So, right, you can see if you were to use the National Wetland Inventory, you can get a sense of what these different wetland types are. So you've got estuarine emergent here in the purple areas. You've got palustrin emergent in these orange areas. You've got palustrin forested in these yellow-green areas, right? There you can find here. I've been talking about the link, but it's down in the notes, so if you go down and look at it, you can find it. So here, this overlays all of the permits dating back to the early 1990s, where these permits are. Now, we talked part about this earlier. You can follow development trends, right? Part of those development trends are based on whether or not the areas that are impacted, if they have wetlands, if those wetlands are jurisdictional. You can see that a lot of the activity is occurring up here where you have these palustrin forested and maybe to a lesser extent palustrin emergent wetlands. These are areas that don't benefit from protections. So where do you have mitigation banks? Well, you can see that these are spread out, but there's quite a lot of them, and they're in areas that are reasonably appropriate for where the impacts are occurring, right? And again, um, because these are professionally managed, because they are monitored, because they are maintained, which doesn't always happen on the small individual sites. Again, much larger probability of success. Now, why aren't there mitigation banks on Galveston Island? Well, in this instance, there's a lot of opportunity for if you do need restoration. Um, there's a lot of opportunity for that restoration to be um, done in cooperation with nonprofits like the Galveston Bay Foundation. But the other thing is, Galveston Island is relatively small. A lot of the areas that can be developed have been developed. There are a lot of offsets. We talked about the Coastal Heritage Preserve that the Artist Boat has set aside. The state park is another big one. The Galveston Bay Foundation has a lot of property on Galveston Island. And so the need really isn't there. When you look at where a lot of the development is occurring within the lower watershed, it's not occurring on Galveston Island, it's occurring up in these other areas. And because there's not the protections on those wetlands, which there are on a lot of the remaining wetlands on Galveston Island, the need is more up in these areas. Okay, so how do we assess success? You really, when we approach this, right? So when I'm going out to design either a monitoring project for a client or I'm doing research of my own with students, um, we have to look at things like, do the restoration projects comply with the permit requirements? So if it's mitigation for compensatory mitigation for some permit, is it legally successful? All right. The other thing is, and what I on the research side is more often the question for us is, do those projects approach natural conditions? Is there ecologic success in those? So most of my recent work has been in that area. Um, in either case, we're focused on, do they meet and actually, this is especially true when we're meeting legal success, but is also true when we're looking at um, functional success, right? Do you have water tolerant vegetation? Do you have saturation? Are the soils reduced, indicating that they're anoxic, that these are hydric soils? If that's the case, then definitely you've met the legal threshold in many instances, because it really isn't, it doesn't go that deep. Ha ha ha. So, um, for ecologic success, we want to go further than that, right? And so, when we're looking at legal success, oftentimes that success criteria is met relatively quickly. So most permits for compensatory mitigation don't require monitoring any further out than 5 years, and in some instances, it may only require 1 or 2 years. And that's because you're only really, under the permit, typically this is your criteria, right? When we're looking for ecologic success, as you know, even these low coastal marshes take a long time before they're meeting their ecologic peak functional value, where all the ecologic niches that can be filled are filled. Um, so we're often kind of looking for this, field of dreams approach, where if you build it, they will come. You establish the marsh, and then what you're looking for is for other species to start to volunteer in those areas, building complexity, diversity, and filling additional ecologic niches so that you do achieve that peak functional value. But that takes a longer period of time, and thus the monitoring or the research that goes into that oftentimes has to occur much further out in terms of the time frame. So the field of dream hypothesis, this, if you build it, they will come. And again, it's all about developing complexity and diversity that's comparable to what you would see in a natural marsh, right? So oftentimes studies, so on the research side, when I'm going back and looking at living shoreline sites, for instance, that, I might have done the construction on those sites 15, 20 years ago. Um, at this point, we go out, we're comparing those restored or constructed sites to natural reference marshes of that same type, and hopefully in the same water body, in order to determine, okay, has it reached the same functional level as this reference condition, whatever that reference condition is. So in many instances, we're looking at both structure and function, so the physical attributes and the processes. And again, we're trying to determine, have we gotten to what the original system would have looked like? Or are we somewhere still down here? And is it still approaching that? Or has it failed? Which again, sometimes is the case. And again, from my own personal experience, you oftentimes see if a marsh makes it into its fifth year, typically if conditions are relatively stable, that's a really good sign. But I will say that even some marshes that have met that standpoint, things happen, and you might see marsh failure 10, even 15 years out. We saw that with some of the research that we did in Pierce Marsh. I'll share that with you at a later point. But the so it's not over till it's over. I guess is where I'm going with that. Okay. So let's look at a couple case studies here. I'm going to end with one, and then we'll pick up the next two when we get to the next presentation. But so let's look at this first one. It was done over on the East Coast and involved restoration of historic Spartina, where there had been an invasion of Phragmites. Phragmites is the Australian cane. We do have issues with this in the Galveston Bay area as well. I'm thinking about areas up close towards High Island being some of the worst areas I've seen, but you do see it all over the Bay Area down here, the Lower Bay. All right, so if you look, so here we've got our stable isotopes. Remember this, right? So we've got our nitrogen and our carbon, and we can use those to determine the food webs. And you can see the difference here between the reference marsh, the Spartina marsh that they used as their reference, versus the Phragmites invaded area where they're targeting their restoration. So you can see here that where the Phragmites became dominant, the predators ended up having to switch to more of a detritus-based food web, right? So in this instance here, I'm sorry, I have to look at this bigger screen so that I can see clearly. You can see that they're feeding on detritivores more, where here they were feeding more on, so these, again, predators were feeding more on the herbivores that were then eventually feeding on this leaf litter. So this is the bottom of your food web in both instances. But where the Phragmites took over, it really affected the food web very significantly. And we can see that through those heavy isotopes. So where they did the restoration, it recreated that original food web. The interesting thing in my mind is where you had a mix, right? So if you had some Phragmites and some Spartina, there were still, the food web still suggests that they preferred the Spartina even where the Phragmites was available. So the Phragmites really is, it's really a last resort, and really only where you have a complete takeover of that invasive plant. The unfortunate thing is that when Phragmites does invade, it typically does completely take over. Can be extremely pervasive. It is high biomass production. It grows so tall that it shades a lot of things out. But this is an interesting finding here in that sense. So with that, I think we are. I think we're going to wrap up for today, and we're going to pick up here in a little bit with the third part of this. We're going to close out. We're going to look at a couple more case studies. So I will see you then.